This is Titus. Welcome to episode 55, where we will be continuing our discussion on Ernst Junger with his memoir, Storm of Steel. Joining me in the Camera Stellata, we have Nick Mason. Hello, sir.
Hey.
We also have, from Myth of the 20th Century, Hans Lander. Welcome back, sir.
Hi there.
And also from Myth of the 20th Century, a first-time guest on Kulturkampf, Mr. Adam Smith. Adam, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Oh, no worries, my friend, no worries. So, before we begin our discussion of the book, and this is going to be more of a free-form conversation, the memoir itself does deal with Junger's experiences and exploits throughout World War I. The narrative of it, it's harder to discuss and sort of pierce out segments of it and sort of discuss in detail. It's very much a flowing memoir. Very much.
It's very straightforward.
Yes, it is. It is. But before we get into the book and into the tragedy of the European Holocaust, Nick, do you want to just sort of bring up Junger as a character, as Junger as a man?
Yeah. Okay, Jünger was unquestionably a man of iron. He was the perfect embodiment of the soldier, of the ideal soldier. And many people, I think, his book stands out in contrast to the other accounts of the First World War, from the English side in the case of Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, or on the French side with Remarques, I don't know if it's pronounced the last name, but famous All Quiet on the Western Front, which I think pretty common in America that's read in school. I know I did. I happened to read that in school. And I don't think you could find a better contrast to Storm of Steel than All Quiet on the Western Front, where Storm of Steel is heroic and really unsparing. All Quiet is sentimental, emotional, anti-heroic, you might even say. And people have sort of chastised the book as, even at times you'll hear people say it's a glorification of war. I don't know. Have you guys heard that? I've heard that.
It's one of the main critiques of Junger.
Yeah, I took a Weimar, like an early modern German history course, and was also part Weimar history course, and that was a big part of the criticism of Junger in that class was this book and Fire and Blood is one of his other works that glorify the war too much and glorify violence too much.
It's one of the main reasons why he's always leaped in with National Socialists, even though he wasn't a National Socialist. But it's the charge that they make is that he's pro-war, he's pro-combat, so therefore he's a Nazi.
And he was sensitive to that. In subsequent versions of the book, he actually tried to tone it down a little bit so that people were not misinterpreting what he was trying to communicate. Junger was part of what was eventually going to be called the German, the Conservative Revolution. Mm. So his ideas in the aftermath of the war and the kind of stuff he was writing, there was some aspects of that are definitely copacetic with National Socialism, with fascism.
He was a monarchist, though, right? He was a devout monarchist,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was... I guess maybe the right way to put it is he was too reactionary for National Socialism. Mm. But he definitely identified a lot of the same problems that the other famous hero of the First World War went on to solve. But I'd just like to give some sort of context to his sort of spiritual ethos about it, because the sentimentalism and that you'll see in All Quiet, that's not the kind of virtue that you would want in a soldier. A soldier, the key ideal for a soldier of the the purest form, so to speak, would be the one of disinterested violence, detached violence. That's the idea that you see in the ancient Aryan text of the Bhagavad Gita, for instance. I mean, that the premise in the Bhagavad Gita is you have Arjuna was sort of he knew that like there was to be a war between these two big families, and he had people on both sides, and he would effectively have to kill his brothers and countrymen, and he saw that this was the outcome, and he too would likely have to die, but that was less of his concern than having to slay his fellow man. And the god Krishna, or one of the manifestations of the god, comes to counsel him on this, and that's the substance of the text, is him explaining why it is that he has to fight and kill and ultimately die. And let me just read a few choice little bits. Now, the pity which prevents the warrior from fighting when he recognizes among the ranks of the enemy some of his erstwhile friends and closest relatives is described by Krishna. That is to say, by the spiritual principle as impurities, not at all befitting a man who knows the value of life. They lead not to the highest planets, but to infamy. We have already seen this theme appear many times in the traditional teachings of the West. Either you will be killed on the battlefield and attain the heavenly planets, or you will conquer and enjoy the earthly kingdom. Therefore, give up determination and fight. And here, one more. Therefore, Arjuna, surrendering all your works unto me, with full knowledge of me, without desire for profit, with no claims of proprietorship, and free from lethargy, fight. I mean, this is the ultimate warrior ideal, is a commitment to the simple task you've been given, to fight and kill and to die. And I think Jünger is a perfect expression of this, because looking at it from where we stand in the current year, World War I, the European Holocaust, was a massive tragedy where the best men from European blood were sent through this charnel house, and many of them did not survive. So it's easy to look at it from a perspective of tragedy, but in order to appreciate Jünger's account of it, I think it's important to consider his attitude. For instance, to give you an example of this, he in the famous Christmas piece, the Pax Noel, there was a film made about that at one point, where during Christmas the armies had a sort of a temporary truce. You guys are familiar with this?
First year of the war.
Yeah, they played soccer.
Yeah, they played soccer. Yeah.
Yeah, Jünger was very much against this. He believed that it goes against the spirit of war.
To him, meaning to win, to kill the enemy, to do what?
Yeah, the enemy is the enemy. You don't play ball with the enemy. You don't have drinks with them. You shoot them. So
well, he was. I guess we can at least mention this. As we talk about his beginnings, he was on day one, I think, one of the people to sign up to join the army. And I'm curious what you guys think his motivations were. Was it, that a man's job is to serve? Did he have any particular animosity towards the English or the French? What was his motivation, or it was just the sort of philosophy of you need to fight for your country?
I think it's in parts patriotism and also I think sort of youthful adventurism. Something about Jünger that almost got him into some serious trouble was before World War I, he actually ran off to join the French Foreign Legion, which was considered by the German Empire to be an act of treason.
Sure.
And it was, because he ran off, I think at the age of 16, his parents were able to finagle, his return, basically, basically blaming it on sort of youthful ignorance. But yeah, I think there's definitely an adventurous spirit to Jünger, and I think it's the war matured it into a philosophy of war and a philosophy of conflict.
Yeah, I think he matured as the war started, as a war will do to anyone. But he wrote in the beginning of his book, growing up in an age of security, we shared a yearning for danger, for the experience of the extraordinary. We were enraptured by war. We set out in a rain of flowers and a drunken atmosphere of blood and roses. Surely the war had to supply us with what we wanted, the great, overwhelming, the hallowed experience. We thought it was of it as manly as action, a merry dueling party of flowered, blood-dewed meadows. No finer death in all the world than anything to participate and not have to stay at home. And I think shortly thereafter he sees his first body and the reality hits. But he certainly was yearning for something, for adventure, it seems.
Yeah, before the shooting started, it's very quaint. Like there, when he's in Belgium and then in parts of France, I suppose very early on, he's just sort of describing the daily life of the soldiers hanging out there, and they're like laying in the grass, or they're sitting around reading, or just frying up bacon, or smoking, or hitting on local women. Like there's no grimness to any of it. It's very different from All Quiet on the Western Front or any other account of World War One.
You know what's interesting? At the beginning of World War II, it was very much like that. When the French and English declared war on Germany, they basically had a no man's land, or DMZ, whatever you want to call it, between the countries. And all they were doing was blasting propaganda over the lines and sort of, just hanging out, essentially. Waiting for something to start, and then it did at one point, obviously. But the prelude to actual conflict was quite mundane in World War II as well.
Yeah, and it almost seems charming to him, or charming the way he tells it.
Well,
it bears mentioning.
Oh no, go ahead, Nick.
It bears mentioning his attitude towards the enemies. He has some positive things to say. I don't have the quote on hand, but he has very high praise for the English. He felt that they were a worthy enemy, and that he had a lot of respect for them. And in keeping with the ideal of disinterested or dispassionate violence, he also didn't have hatred for them. Mm-hmm. However, there are points where he describes sort of in a way almost approaching guilt. It's not quite guilt because he explains it as it was, but there are times when people start to get a little bit energetic there with the hatred and with the passion, and he kind of sees himself getting caught up in that, and he sees other people more so. But at the end of the day, it's really much more of a cool commitment to duty, and it takes an.
What was his rank? Was he just?
Well, it started out.
He was a private.
He was a private, and by the end, he was a lieutenant, and then he was captain.
Mm-hmm.
He was a captain in World War II, so maybe he kept the rank. I'm not sure how it works.
Yeah, he was quickly promoted up because people around him could see. He also he had this remarkable ability to not die.
Yeah, we should talk about that. So throughout nearly every major battle he's in, or sometimes not even battle, like at one point they're just sitting in a room in the second floor or third floor of a building, and suddenly a shell explodes in the wall and puts a big piece of shrapnel in him, and he just sort of passes out, and then they take him to the med bay, they dig it out, and they send him back to combat. Like
there was another instance where he was put on I guess a scouting mission or whatever they call it, recon, and basically he was ordered to go into the river and look at the French and the opposing side, and he was with some of his compatriots who alerted the French to their presence, and one of his friends got shot, and basically he had to stand there for something like 10 hours until he could get out of there, but that's almost pure luck. I mean, I wonder how much of this is skill, and if I can make a sort of a stretch of an analogy for a moment, Warren Buffett, famed American investor, has said that if you basically look at the top mutual funds in the year, a lot of that is due to just random chance. Because if you take a coin, for example, and you have 10,000 coins, like roughly the number of mutual funds, you could say. And you have one person assigned to each coin, and you have them all flip it, 100 times or something. In that large number of funds in this case, but in people, for example, in the case of an army, eventually, just by the sheer number of people involved, you're going to have somebody who just gets heads every single time. And so you can even apply that concept to the army, where there's just a lucky guy, and he's going to get promoted because he's the one that's still alive. There was a scene in Starship Troopers where the guy who is like standing after his lieutenant gets shot in the head, like I think it's Michael Ironside's like, "You're in charge now, son," and he's like, "Thanks," And you know what to do, if you ever get injured.
Well, he gets injured. I think Nick, you were saying before the show, or maybe it was.
He's shot like 14 times.
14 times. Yeah.
Mostly in the leg, it seemed, in the arm or the leg. It was always one of his appendages that was.
Well, and then finally, right by his Iron Cross.
Yeah.
Keep in mind though, like he wasn't going through the war and trying to survive. He was trying to fight. So he's putting himself in these situations too. So something about, nowadays there's no one who's even half the man that Jünger was, but even back then he was a cut above the rest. So it is something remarkable, because he wasn't just a unthinking dog either. I
have a passage from when he was in the med bay. At last we reached the tin and concrete cladded shelter that went by the odd name of Columbus's Egg. I was dragged down the stairs and laid on a wooden ballot. With me in the room were a couple of officers I didn't know, sitting and listening in silence to the hurricane concert of the artillery. One, I later heard, was Lieutenant Bomber. The other, a medical orderly by the name of Helms. Never have I enjoyed a drink more than the mixture of rainwater and red wine that he gave me to sip. I was burning up with a fever. I struggled for breath and felt depressed by the notion that the concrete ceiling of the shelter was on my chest, and that with each breath I had to heave it up. The assistant surgeon Coffin came in, himself quite out of breath. He had run across the battlefield, shells following him at every step. He recognized me, bent over me, and I saw his face contort to a soothingly smiling grimace. After him came my battalion commander, and when strict man that he was, he patted me kindly on the back. I had to smile because I got the idea that the Kaiser himself would appear at any moment and ask how I was doing. So this is like much later in the book. This is page 126, after he's been wounded several times, and he notes that this orderly recognized him because he'd been in there several times already, kept coming back and surviving somehow.
And it is worth noting to the reader and to the listener rather, that Jünger was a stormtrooper. He was a shock troop, and these were for those who don't know their World War I history. These were the trench fighters of the German Imperial Army. They were the guys who would go in to the enemy trenches to cause as much havoc as they can, and the mortality rate for them, as would be expected, was obscenely high.
Yeah, I'll bet. I mean, I was just curious if you knew how many of them were, like what percentage of the army was that? Was it a small elite group, or was it a fair number of them?
There were, I think, as the war dragged on, there were more of them. Let me see here if I can get some numbers for you.
Well, why are we looking at for that? Like, sure. So he talks about they start to realize, because tactics have to start adapting, right, as the war goes on. It's a new kind of war, a new technological kind of war, and so they started to find out things that worked and things that didn't work. And he came to the conclusion that what would be needed is you need these tight groups of dedicated stormtroopers, and then everyone else is really just there to provide fire. And that most of the progress that he found, most of the progress was made by individuals doing individual acts of heroism. And
I believe most of the time they were just shelling each other with artillery. and
Yeah, but then
late
you
in the
don't move the
war,
line. That's the thing. Like,
well, right, but you have to soften it first. You can't just go up to the machine gun nest. You have to knock it out first, and
well, of
then
course, but we're
hopefully
talking
you
about
can
the price of a
fight through
mile.
what's left.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and so yeah, they were crucial. They were crucial to advancing.
I'm looking here at sort of the history of the German Stormtrooper. It looks like they were created in 1915 with 2 companies, and it looks like by the end of the war there were at least 46 assault companies fighting for the German Empire.
So it's an exponential increase.
Yeah.
That once they realized that these guys were the only ones who were getting anything done, probably.
Right.
What was the other technique? They just kind of went in like a wave pattern. They just kind of walked slowly in formation, like
Well, in the
Civil
early
War.
days of the war, they actually still had mounted cavalry, and they rode through Belgium.
They were still. I mean, up until right up until like
Gotta stay low.
the necessity of the of the trenches, they were still fighting in sort of Napoleonic battle formations. The early battles of World War One were fought like that.
He describes a very it's very nightmarish, apocalyptic sort of scene towards the end where he sees there's a cow. I forget what you call it, with the horse-drawn artillery, and he said that this had gotten to be a rare sight, and in the chaos of the battlefields and all the blood and smoke and shrapnel, there was like this horse that had gotten loose and didn't know where to go, and it was just freaking out. That image really stuck with me. But I would also like to point out the guy had a sense of humor, which maybe describing this guy you'd think he didn't, but he actually did have a sense of humor. There's a lot of little bits in it that I thought were quite funny. Like when he's describing
Michael Hoffman described him as being extremely serious compared to some of the other writers.
Yeah,
but I'm sure there's some elements in there.
I thought some of it was pretty funny. Like that the whole arrangement that they had with the guy was like the king of I don't know what translation, the king of Q.
Yeah.
You know, and he was amused by this. He even says that like there was not enough of the simple soldier in him to not indulge in it.
I just remember the anecdote where he was trying to get into the bathroom or go through the bedroom doorway, and he kept like the door wouldn't move, and it's like, what's going on here? And it was after like 3 times he pushed it open, and there was the farmhouse's daughter in there who had just gotten out of her bath with no clothes on, and it was like the curses that were thrown at him. He still remembers to this day. That's the only thing I remember that was sort of humorous.
Would you like to get into the opening, Titus?
Sure. Yeah, let's do that. These are the opening lines of the memoir. The train stopped at Bazencourt, a small town in Champagne, and we got out, full of awe and incredulity. We listened to the slow, grinding pulse of the front, a rhythm we were to become mightily familiar with over the years. The white ball of a shrapnel shell melted far off, suffusing the gray December sky. The breath of battle blew across to us, and we shuddered. Did we sense that almost all of us, some sooner, some later, were to be consumed by it, on days when the dark rumbling yonder would crash over our heads like an incessant thunder? We had come from lecture halls, school desks, and factory workbenches, and over the brief weeks of training we had bonded together into one large and enthusiastic group. Grown up in an age of security, we shared a yearning for danger, for the experience of the extraordinary. We were enraptured by war. We had set out in a rain of flowers and drunken atmosphere, of blood and rose. Surely the war had to supply us with what we wanted: the great, the overwhelming, the hallowed experience. We thought of it as manly, as action, a merry dueling party on flowered blood, bedewled meadows. No finer death in all the world. Anything to participate. not to have to stay at home. So I think, obviously, with these opening lines, it signals to what we discussed earlier about the youthful adventurism and sort of the youthful yearning for war and for combat, for adventure. And you also sort of have in that first paragraph, you have this very scenic and pastoral landscape, and just the imagery that he employs regarding combat and how the audience and Jünger are introduced to it as something that's far away but ever encroaching. I think is it stands testament to to the events of the memoir.
Well, it's interesting. He was probably one of the few who had actually seen combat in this peer group prior to him joining. How old was he when he joined up with the Wehrmacht? I mean, he'd gone to the foreign French Legion, ironically, the new enemy now, before at 16. But when was this? How old was he?
He might have been 18 for this.
He was 18 or 19 when he joined up.
Okay. Yeah, so this wasn't his first experience, but he still wanted to see something. Maybe he didn't see anything in the Foreign Legion, though. They weren't exactly engaged in wars.
With the French Foreign Legion, I think he did like maybe a few weeks of training before his parents were able to finagle him back.
So he's like the opposite of kids today. It's like they send their kids to military academy and he just goes by himself.
Well,
like parents
it's funny you mentioned
him.
There was a couple of years ago, or several years ago, there was a young cadet at West Point who went AWOL one day, and he went missing. No one knew where he went, and then shows up again 5 years later, and it's like, I'm back, and everyone's going, where were you? I joined the French Foreign Legion, and I served my 5-year contract, and I'm back.
Holy smokes! Yeah. Why didn't he stay in France?
Dominique Venner joined the French Foreign Legion as a teenager as well to go maintain the French occupation of Algeria.
So why the French Foreign Legion? Why don't you join the British? I mean, those are the two big colonial powers. It's interesting. This is like.
Well, the French.
Well, he's a Venner. He was French, but
okay.
I mean,
yeah.
The Foreign Legion was also
this West Point guy and.
Yeah, well, the thing with the French Foreign Legion is that if you are a wanted man, you can join them and they'll make you disappear.
Interesting.
Yes. So the French Foreign Legion is notable. I think militarily they're most notable for their tank divisions. But
yeah, now they're sort of relegated to like American Spec Ops style operations, where they drop in some former French colonial territory and shoot some bad guys and then leave. That's what they were doing down in Mali. They helped out in Afghanistan, raiding some villages, the American forces. They still work in like South America. That's all they really do now.
Probably provide some security for drug transportation.
Yeah. You got to make some side business here and there.
Yeah, but there's a lot of criminals and people wanted for one reason or another. They joined the French Foreign Legion.
But still, their training program is supposed to be one of the most rigorous in the world. It's on par with the Navy SEALs and the like.
Well, once they start rounding up dissidents in America, I mean, maybe that'll still be an option. Who knows? I don't know. But
provided Le Pen eventually wins over there, but that's doubtful.
Yeah. So we should probably talk about what it's like to be, I guess, a 19-year-old. And I don't know what you're told as a 19-year-old in early 20th century Germany when you're going off to war. You're getting on the train. Like, are you told there's going to be a lot of combat? Are you excited for that? Are you told it's going to be boring? What do you expect as a stormtrooper at 19?
Well, I think this is another thing that sort of delineates the onset reaction of World War I and World War II. Whereas World War II began sort of a very sort of somber and high degree of reticence on everyone involved, from the Germans to the Allies. World War I began with a lot of fanfare. specifically on the German side, as the German Empire was in its ascendancy, and their last big war was the Franco-Prussian War, in which they were able to steamroll the French Empire and effectively end it with the abdication of Napoleon the Third, I think. So I think that was on the mindset of a lot of the German youth that recruited, was that they're going to be able to to outdo their fathers and grandfathers, what they were able to do against the French.
There's an interview where he was talking about things that had impressed, memories of the war and things that had impressed him. And one thing that I remember is he was talking about how he remembered the first time he had seen steel helmets, and how he was just sort of captivated by this because it reminded him of antiquity. You see something of the. I mean, he was also a very well-read guy at the time. I was unclear if he spoke English or not. I mean, I'm sure he knew some words. He obviously was fluent in French.
Well, there's a part where he actually says where he's kind of crawling around in the bushes trying to avoid detection, and he overhears voices, and he remarks that the voices he overheard could have easily been mistaken for either German or English in his mind.
Yeah,
so I think that speaks to the similarity in both.
Oh well,
and
those voices, Hans, if I remember correctly, those were some of the those were Indians.
Oh really?
Yeah, they were Indians. They
were
British.
Okay, I didn't remember that. All right.
Yeah, they were like probably high caste Indians because he described them as being very big, and they're probably from northern India, some British imperial. I
forget the name, but there's a name for these kind of people of color in the British Army.
POC.
And they have like this like special regiment that was supposedly pretty good, but
Gurkhas.
Yeah, that's it.
They were Southeast Asians, I think.
Yeah.
The Gurkhas, I think, were Southeast Asian.
Mm. But yeah, those people, he didn't understand the language because it was one he didn't speak. Yeah, and now that I think about it, I mean, he was reading towards the end, like he had stumbled upon a copy of Lawrence Stern. Interesting enough, one of my all-time favorite books, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, which also interesting is probably the furthest you could get away from heroic literature.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's funny that he would have a taste for that at all. And so, I can't imagine that would be in translation. And I assume he was reading it in English.
Oh, and just to clarify, the Gurkhas were of Nepali ethnicity, so they were just to clarify that for folks.
So this brings up what you're saying. That brings up something I was wondering throughout all of this, and maybe Titus knows. How much of the rest of this story is sort of embellished? Is it just sort of happenstance that he finds this book, or is it all of it accurate the way that it was meant to be told?
As far as I can tell, this is a straight memoir.
It's straight. Yeah. It's straight. I forget the exact circumstances of how he stumbled upon the Stern, but there was an earlier part where I found Don Quixote in a
in a bombed out house. Yeah,
right. And also, one of the parts I thought was funny was the when the British were bombing them with Schiller. If you remember that, they were dropping literature, and they dropped Schiller's what is it? Britannia. I forget the work, but they were dropping like romantic literature, and the German high command actually had a price on the heads of these books. He thought that was kind of funny because the idea was, of course, to lower morale through literature. That's pretty good.
Very Anglo.
Yeah, that's a very Anglo thing to do.
Well, and as as Jünger observes, the high command clearly saw that as a legitimate threat, so they were trying to pick these things up.
Well,
But
yeah,
go ahead, Hans.
I don't know if you guys have seen Dunkirk, the most recent World War II film. But there's early in the film, the German military decides to drop in pamphlets showing like the exact positions of German army units around the area of Dunkirk in English, saying like, you're surrounded. You should give up.
That's historically accurate.
Here's where we are.
Actually, Goebbels actually hand wrote a few propaganda leaflets that were bombarded during the invasion of France. Actually, I think it was actually towards his messages. I think were towards French troops, but they were basically like, "Look, you guys already lost. Just lay down your arms, and we can." We can stop all this foolishness.
Oh, the propaganda directed at the Americans was very funny. I wish I had some.
Didn't it always portray Americans as like blacks? That was
the Italians. That was a big thing.
Well, the black. I mean, daily reminder that this is a personal point of annoyance for me is when you hear these like bourgeois system Negroes in America like bitching about like National Socialist Germany or something. Like they take personally the existence of National Socialist Germany and as if it was an anti-black state or something,
Well, the Rhineland bastards, right? I mean, they were.
Yeah, well, there was
gotten rid of.
There was that. I mean, Hitler observed that, and that was the French doing of deliberately putting Negro troops on the Rhine. Yes, sick frogs, man, sick frogs. But like the thing to note there is. In fact, Goebbels, I think, was shocked at the racism towards the black soldiers on the American side. I mean, America, talk about blacks, like America was far more racist against blacks than Germany because Germany didn't have any Negroes. Which I guess is worse, It's a child is more upset about being ignored than scorned, but...
Well, in the American case, the black regiments were segregated, and I think they may have had white captains in some cases, or all cases. I'm not sure, but they only integrated, I think, in Vietnam or the beginning of Korea.
Yeah, I think Korea.
Yeah, that may be it. But I was curious about the English and French, who did have at least colonial blacks in their empires. Do you guys know if those were segregated, or I think in the case of the Gurkhas, obviously that was like a separate unit. I'm wondering if they had done that.
I can't imagine integrated units existing.
No, not in World War I.
The French, I don't think in World War I. The French had that in World War II. They had integrated units, especially down in Vichy, France, of a mix of Frenchmen, Algerians, various Africans, pretty much everyone from the French Empire showed up and had mixed units to fight.
And before we trespass into the realm of African kookery, there were black members of the Afrika Korps, if my recollection serves. Not many, of course, but a few.
Yeah.
Well, daily reminder that the Waffen SS was the most multicultural fighting unit ever to exist.
Exactly.
Take that diversity.
Yeah.
All right, so I was going to go on with Les Espargs.
Yes. This is the first engagement.
Fucking frogs, man.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Come on, say it right. Come on.
How do you say it? You teach me.
I would assume it's Les Espargs.
Les Espargs. Like well, there you have it, dear listener.
A man of distinction, Adam. Well done.
Okay, thanks.
Here is Jünger. As conditions grew brighter, a German battery opened up from a stretch of woods just behind the trench. It didn't take long for the enemy to reply. Suddenly, I was struck by a mighty crash behind me, and I saw a steep pillar of smoke rising. Still unfamiliar with the sounds of war, I was not able to distinguish the hisses and whistles and bangs of our own gunnery from the ripping crash of enemy shells, and hence to get a sense of the lines of engagement. Above all, I could not account for the way I seemed to be under fire from all sides. so that the trajectories of various shells were crisscrossing apparently aimlessly over the little worn trenches where a few of us were holed up. This effect, for which I could see no cause, disquieted me and made me think. I still viewed the machinery of conflict with the eyes of an inexperienced recruit. The expressions of bellicosity seemed as distant and peculiar to me as events on another planet. This meant I was unafraid, feeling myself to be invincible. I couldn't believe I was a target to anyone, much less that I might be hit. So, returned to my unit, I surveyed the terrain in front of me with great indifference. In my pocket diary, I wrote down, a habit of mine later on as well, the times and the intensity of the bombardment. And that pocket diary is, I mean, this is why his memoir was so vivid and accurate. He was recording this stuff, and I think you can tell he made a special effort to any man who died heroically in battle. He gives a mention to them, at least the ones that he could note. He tries to keep account of that. And in the case, there was, he had like one guy brought up for the Iron Cross. So he was paying keen attention to things and recording things, and that's, I think, part of the clarity and straightforwardness of this was that it was taken from his records that he was keeping during the struggle. So going on here. Towards noon, the artillery fire had increased to a kind of savage pounding dance. The flames lit around us incessantly. Black, white, and yellow clouds mingled. The shells was black smoke, which the old-timers called Americans, or coal boxes, ripped with incredible violence. And all the time the curious canary-like twittering at dozens of fuses, with their cutout shapes, in which the trapped air produced a flute-like trill. They drifted over the long surf of explosions like ticking copper toy clocks or mechanical insects. The odd thing was that the little birds in the forest seemed quite untroubled by the myriad noise. They sat peaceably over the smoke in their battered boughs. In short intervals of firing, we could hear them singing happily or ardently to one another, if anything, even inspired or encouraged by the dreadful noise on all sides. The battle at Les Esparges was my first. It was quite unlike what I had expected. I had taken part in a major engagement without having clapped eyes on a single live opponent. It wasn't until much later that I experienced the direct coming together, the climax of battle in the form of waves of attackers on an open field, which for decisive, murderous moments would break into the chaos and vacuity of the battlefield. So this is him getting close to the battle and starting to experience this without what would come later, which is the brutal hand-to-hand trench warfare. So this time it's still heavy monotony, and they would be arriving in places where there had been shelling, and they would be shelled, but he had yet to really get into the hardcore combat.
Well, notice something. He's not naming any of the technical specs of any of this stuff. He's not name dropping ballistic shell size or the cannon size or the cannon name or the weapons being used. He's describing them as copper toy clocks or mechanical insects. He's not interested at all in trying to sound sophisticated, which I guess lends credence to the idea that this isn't embellished, that this is done just sort of from a first person perspective.
I kind of like that. I dislike it when people start basically showing off with their knowledge of some obscure piece of information that is really irrelevant. I mean, just tell us what's going on and why it's important.
And it's
that's the type of communication I prefer.
And it is. I think there's a very real, because he's using soldiers' language here. Calling the shells coal boxes or Americans. I mean, that's soldiers' jargon. That's not someone who's an engineering student or a factory worker who's building these things, these shells.
that's a key point. Like technology, his relationship to technology is worth mentioning. And when I read Mechanical Insects, I immediately think of his later novel, The Glass Bees. It's exactly the kind of I mean, in that book there are literal mechanical insects, and that's how he would write about it. He has he's certainly not impressed. Like he sees technology for what it is, but he's not a fetishist of technology by any means. I mean, you can easily get the sense that he would probably prefer to be fighting an older kind of war. And as I mentioned earlier, like he was enamored by the steel helmets, but because they were evocative of an older kind of war.
Well, that interview I mentioned before the show, I think there are two Scandos, right? They're Norwegians or Swedes, I can't remember, who kind of they don't really ambush interview him, but they don't tell him that he's being filmed until later on in the interview. But he mentions that he's not, or the meeting of technology or the digital world and man just doesn't interest him at all. He thinks it's beneath a worth of understanding, that it's sort of banal, that it devalues any sort of real intellectual work to be done.
Well, in the Glass Bees, that's the character is an old cavalryman, right, who finds himself in a world where horses are no longer relevant, and he's out of work and ends up going to work for this sort of shadowy baron of technology who makes these magic films and stuff.
Right. There's like an infamous photo of from World War I. It's either of a French or a German soldier, a cavalryman, who has a long steel lance, a small sidearm on his right hip, and he has a gas mask on his face, riding a horse in the middle of a battlefield. Which hits that kind of that theme you're talking about right there, where it's sort of the end of the old European war, even though I think the Soviets used horses in World War II, sort of by necessity. And World War I was the end of cavalry charges and things like that.
The Germans did too. They just didn't film it.
Oh, really?
They wanted to show off their tanks.
and it's the end of all chivalry and war, because this gives way to, I think, the kind of thing that Jünger would find most distasteful, and all of us should find distasteful, which is the liberal conception of war, whereby the enemy is not an opponent who, an honorable opponent who you're going to fight to the death. The enemy is a moral criminal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are to be afforded no chivalry. They are a lecherous moral criminal, and inhuman, subhuman. Because that's the only way the liberal can justify war.
Yeah, this reminds me of the Obama drone program. He came up with something called the determination matrix, which was this algorithm, effectively, whereby him and his policy nerds would determine, based on 50 characteristics or whatever, a big group of guys who got droned next. And it would always say, well, we, in his very stereotypical voice, we have taken the fight to these very backwards, these very immoral people, and we're trying to bring a stable life to Afghanistan and the values we think they should have in their lives. It was always just so cynical. When you really think about it, it's like, okay, so you have an algorithm with some nerds in a back room deciding who gets droned next, and he never, like, the only point of contact is some guy behind a computer screen operating the drone in Arizona.
Well, what a conceit for liberalism, having to rely on an algorithm, having to rely on a computer program to determine whether or not you want to bomb a wedding. Isn't that just atypical of the society in which we are living under, gentlemen?
Right. I think Jünger would be down for bombing a wedding, but he would want to do it himself.
Yes.
He would want to actually run up there and throw the frag grenade into right up against the priest officiating the wedding.
Yeah, well, regarding the liberal conception of war, this is something that we can definitely talk on, and just in terms of this also goes into uh, propaganda and the propaganda of the First World War, and one of the most interesting facets, and of course, we all know. Perhaps to a lesser extent, the exaggerations that the British and Americans employed onto their populace regarding German soldiers, their conduct in Belgium, for instance, where the posters would show German soldiers impaling Belgian babies. You know, completely insane and totally illogical.
Yeah, the Hun, the brute, like the big gorilla holding the woman.
Yeah.
The German
Well,
Hun.
it's funny. There's a part in the book where he picks up a British paper, and he mentions that the so-called Huns, of course, referring to himself.
Well, it's interesting to note while Nick, we are in all agreement here that the liberal conception of war and sort of the propagandizing of it is truly repellent. One of it was a propaganda boost for they weren't allies in World War One, where they were called the Entente. Was it the Entente powers?
The Central Powers.
Yeah, well, that was the Axis.
Yeah, the
equivalent
Axis were
during-
the Central Powers. The
Uh-huh.
the Entente powers. I believe that's correct.
Yeah, that's right.
But the British, the British propaganda was that the Germans and Austrians were this brutalizing, evil, wicked force, and it's going to take years and years and years for us to defeat them. It's going to be nothing but toil and hardship on our part. Whereas the German propaganda portrayed the Central Powers as pushovers, as super easy. So 2 years into the conflict, the propaganda that the Germans were pumping out onto their newspapers took a heavy beating in the credibility department.
It's very rich, coming from the same pigs that starved Berlin.
Yes.
2 million people.
Yeah.
Okay, but again, that's what. I mean, that's how these people operate.
I know.
That's just how Anglos operate.
Yeah.
I mean, you seem like you're naive to this. all the historical analysis we do, man, and you're finally realizing what Anglos are like.
Well, this is the beginning of the liberal imperium.
Yeah.
I mean, you have the American pigs getting involved for the Holy War for global democracy.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it today. I mean, Carl Schmitt is a good place to go for analysis on sort of the roots of this. Just the kind of political logic that leads to it.
The American impetus for World War One to this day doesn't make much sense, particularly given the mood of the country at the time. It was the United States was a group of people or the Americans were just a group of people that were so uninterested in what they perceived as just another European war. And throughout the history of the United States, from 1776 up to this point, Europe went through huge wars like the Napoleonic Wars, which you could classify as world wars. I mean, they took place all over the planet, and the Americans were just totally disinterested in anything going on. They were totally disinterested in all the revolutions and wars of 1848, to the fact where they kicked out diplomats from these countries, trying to stay out of it because they just wanted to have nothing to do with it. Had no interest in anything going on in 1871. And had no interest in any of the continued conflicts between the British and the French. And then all of a sudden, the American public is being told, we have to go over there and fight to bring democracy to the Germans, which I don't think really sat well with anyone. The only thing that worked was the Lusitania, was, all the children on the Lusitania who got blown up by the...
Which, as everyone probably here knows,
So
the Germans were taking out full-page ads in American papers explaining
And we were smuggling
warning.
against our code of neutrality. We were smuggling weapons to, and armaments to England. So
yeah, and they were warning people not to take a ship through there. And
and the attitudes after World War I were so bad in regards to foreign wars that when World War II was on the horizon, FDR was polling the American public and finding like over 80% were opposed to going back to war in Europe. Yeah. That one experience, they said, finally, okay, we'll go get involved. They hated it, every second of being involved over there, even though the Americans weren't that involved on the ground fighting.
Yeah, it caused such a tear in the psyche of the Americans that served. I mean, this is where we get the lost generation, right? This is Faulkner and to a very small extent Faulkner, but Fitzgerald.
Hemingway. Yeah, I mean, these guys were driving ambulances over there, but this is why it was necessary to orchestrate the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
What did you have to say, Adam?
The entrance of America to both of the wars were in the later stages, obviously, and in the case of World War I, especially, it was decisive because the war was going quite well, actually, for Germany. They had not lost one piece of territory, and the British were not doing very well, and obviously the French were probably the worst off. But when the Americans showed up, they basically tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. But the explanation for this, it wasn't the American people, as you've laid out, that were asking for it. It was basically the Wilsonian administration somehow was basically convinced that it was in their interest, at least, to bring America in. And Benjamin Friedman, in his famous 1960-something speech in New York, explains that it was basically the Zionist cause that brought them in on the British side, because the British had agreed with the Balfour Declaration to give the Jewish people their homeland in exchange for bringing in the Americans. And I guess it was the sort of banking connections and the influence that the Jews had in New York.
It was the Anglophile Zionist networks.
Yeah.
And there was that's the key to. I mean, Wilson himself was really just a puppet. And the Wilson administration was really run by more so by Colonel Edward Mandell House.
Also, like literally in his last years as president, when he was like semi-comatose, just lying in a bed after a stroke, right?
Right.
Like he was an actual puppet eventually.
I should mention too that Jünger had some German Americans in his company.
Mm.
Yeah, that was common. It happened in World War II as well. You had German immigrants, or even descendants of German immigrants, American citizens who had birthright citizenship was in effect at this point, and they answered the call of the fatherland. They went back to fight.
Well, in theory, there should be no conflict there, no conflict of interest there, because America should have been neutral, but of course not.
Yeah. There's another part of this passage you read earlier, Nick, where he says, "I was unafraid, feeling myself to be invisible. I couldn't believe I was a target to anyone, much less that I might be hit." So, firstly, that's very ironic given the amount of injuries he ends up sustaining throughout the course of the war. But also, I guess everyone kind of feels like that going into conflict, or even into just a paintball match or an airsoft match or a fight or whatever. Like, there's no way. Everyone is the hero of their own story. There's no way I'm going to die.
Yeah, most people believe this. I think most people in general are not fully convinced that they are going to die ever.
Right.
Well, and that's even highlighted further when you can't even see your enemy, right? When it's just shells falling from the sky, there's that element of just absolute randomness. You're not 200 paces away from the French line of soldiers marching towards you. You don't have that. You don't have that visual sort of representation of of your morality, of your mortality. It's just the randomness of shells.
And I'm not even just talking about like war, combat. Like I genuinely believe that most people aren't convinced they're going to die. That it's someone else who's going to die.
Well, later on in Guimont, he says, if a man falls, he's left to die. No one can help. No one knows if he'll return alive. Every day we're attacked, but they won't get through. Everyone knows this is about life and death. Nothing was left in this voice but equanimity, apathy. Fire had burned everything else out of it. It's men like you that you need for fighting. Basically, I mean, later on, he sort of drops the boyish charm, and he recognizes that about anyone can die. People are dying all around him.
Yeah, what's the line?
Everyone dies.
Patton.
Yeah.
Newsflash.
Well, yeah, I mean, you try and convince people of that, man. Be my guest, but I mean, everyone else dies, yeah. But are you gonna die?
Yeah.
The line from Patton was like, and you put your hand in a pile of goo that used to be your best friend's face.
Well, he says, don't die, put a bullet in his belly, like run a bayonet through him, like go
right.
through.
No one ever won a war by dying for their country, but by making the other poor bastard die for his.
Yeah. I mean, not even halfway through the book, that pretty much becomes the Younger mentality. Like he drops all of the, I guess, the lofty, adventurous notions he had of war, and it becomes like just a huge opportunity for him to kill as many French and Englishmen for the Kaiserreich as possible.
Yeah, well, it's funny. On our show, we did a show on Patton, and I pointed out on that show that Patton was in many ways the American Jünger. At least in the sense of they both had this metaphysic of war. I mean, Patton had a lot more of the grandiose in him, of course, but their mentality and the sort of their spiritual approach to warfare is very similar.
Mm-hmm.
And towards antiquity, I think they were both. They both felt a little out of place in modern technological warfare. Because he comments on this at some point. He sees all these brave men die in ways that were sort of by that vagaries of chance. It's like something that they weren't even able to face their enemy, and then their heads blown off.
Patton believed in reincarnation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did. He believed that he was sort of he had been present in other battles in the past.
Yeah, he's saying like antiquity. It's ironic that especially once they develop these huge amounts of artillery and they're just lobbing artillery back and forth over these trenches, that the only way to make any real progress is to go full antiquity and bash someone's head in with a billy club in a trench, like in the mud. Like that's the only way to actually win the war at that point, is who bashes more heads in first.
Well, it's funny too, because I mean, this is the nature of war. Like war changes, and the technology changes war. I wouldn't be surprised if the French were saying similar things at Agincourt.
Yeah, exactly. I was just about to bring that up too. Yeah.
Bemoaning the invention of the longbow.
Yes.
and the use of non-nobility to shower death on.
And their decision to charge downhill into a sea of mud in heavy armor. Yeah.
Well, it's true. I think the crossbow is considered a terror weapon.
Yes.
And there may have been regulations against it.
There are actually, I believe, there were actually laws placed where you, like an army, if you employed crossbowmen, you actually had to pay a fine, basically, because it was regarded as being unfair.
There was a story I remember hearing about a repeating crossbow that was developed somewhere in Western Europe in the medieval era. And the guy goes and shows his king and the king has him put to death, and all proof of the crossbow designs burnt and discarded of, because he knew this, like, the carnage just was, unleashed, and the medieval arms race effectively would just grow out of proportion too quickly. So there was a sense of temperament in everything. It was like, we don't want, these lancing battles are great. They've worked well for 300 years. Why stop?
There's also, wars against brothers, right? Wars against fellow Christians,
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, man.
So we have who's up next?
Oh, I think Hans. Yeah, if you want to do the
next.
daily life in the trenches. And this is something that we can definitely talk about.
Staying in these little earthworks tucked into the landscape, where I am based with half a platoon, offers more freedom of movement than the front line. A gentle slope comes between us and the front. Behind us, there's an ascent to the wooded hill of Andithvenir. 50 paces behind the fortifications, and a rather poorly selected location, is our latrine, a long beam supported on 2 trestles over a ditch. The men like to spend time there, either reading the paper or for companionship, in the matter of canaries, say. This is the front of all the various sinister rumors that course around the front, and they go by the name of bog talk in one instance. Admittedly, the coziness is shattered by the fact that the place, while not overlooked by the enemy, is still vulnerable to fire over the low rise. If they aim just over the ridge, the bullets pass through the dip at the chest height, and a man has to lie flat on the floor to be safe.
This was, I think, one of the more humorous parts of the book. Just the idea of bog talk. That gave me a chuckle.
What we talk about when we talk about bogs.
Yeah.
Well, so what he's saying, a man has to fly out on the floor to be safe. So if you're at the latrine, and it seems like it's common courtesy, he's basically saying that everyone knows where this is, but no one wants to go shoot someone while they're taking a shit at the latrine. That's sort of
Bad
unmanly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although the Anglos probably would do it anyways, but he says lie flat on the floor to be safe. So then you have to, essentially dive into shit to be safe from enemy fire if you're over the latrine. It sounds like a pretty miserable. I mean, it sounds miserable, but he's describing it as cozy, and it's sort of one of the nicer places.
It's the only place where you get to gossip about the other places of the war, other war fronts. Yeah.
Yeah. So this section is probably one of my favorites in this book, because it's the most grueling telling of trench warfare, because of how it doesn't try to dramatize it. It's a simple chronological telling from mid-October 1915 to mid-April 1916 of his time in Douchy. And I want to read some of the entries he starts making, from these points of just the daily carnage that's unleashed. So right off the bat, standing at the dawn on the fire step opposite our Dugo next to the sentry, when a rifle bullet ripped through his forage cap without harming a hair of his head. At the same time, 2 pioneers were wounded on the wires. One had a ricochet through both legs, the other a ball through his ear. In the morning, the sentry on our left flank was shot through both cheekbones. The blood spurted out of him in thick gouts. And to cap it all, when Lieutenant von Invold visited our sector to take pictures of sap and barley 50 yards away, turned to climb down from the outlook, a bullet shattered the back of his skull, and he died on the spot. Large fragments of the skull were left glittering the sentry platform. Also, a man was hit in the shoulder, but not badly. Then the 19th of October. The middle platoon section of trench was attacked with 6-inch shells. One man was hurled against a post by the blast so hard that he sustained serious internal injuries, and a splinter of wood punctured the artery in his arm. In the early morning fog, as we were repairing our wires on the right, we came upon a French corpse that must have been here for many months. That night, 2 men were wounded while unspooling wire. Goodschmidt shot in both hands and one thigh. Schaefer took a bullet in the knee. October 30th. Following a torrential downpour in the night, all the traverses came down and formed a gray, sludgy porridge with the rain, turning the trench into a deep swamp. Our only consolation was that the British were just as badly off as we were, because we could see them bailing out for all they were worth. Since our position has a little more elevation than theirs, we even managed to pump our excess their way. Also, we used rifles with telescopic sights on them. Crumbled trench walls exposed a line of bodies left there from the previous autumn's fighting. So this goes on and on and on until April. This 7-month stretch of daily death and daily mud through the winter and this is in Belgium, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just awful. It's the most miserable experience. This is the worst place you want to be in the winter is Belgium or the Netherlands, because it's a cold, muddy swamp.
Yeah,
it's just terrible. And he mentions that there's bodies still just lying around, hundreds or thousands of bodies just sitting there rotting slowly in the mud that they're sitting in, that they're laying in from the previous autumn, that no one has gone to grab. No one's had, there's been no ceasefire to go and collect bodies. Even in ancient times, I remember even in times of Alexander and his wars with the Persians, they would make time to go grab bodies in the middle of the field. And there would be ceasefires. There'd be an end to the fighting, and sometimes both sides would even help collect bodies for one another, and then fighting would continue again. No such pleasantries were afforded to either side here.
Wouldn't it be done at night in some battles? I mean, I think even
sometimes
during the Civil War,
in the early evening or in the morning or the following morning before the next battle would sort of begin again, but none of that was ever afforded to either side. Or maybe one side maybe the Germans would have been fine with the French or the English getting up to collect their men, but the English were unclear if the Germans would keep their word and vice versa, and it just became sort of like a massive graveyard that everyone fought in.
Well, there's the element of decorum and civility, but and Hans, perhaps you can speak to this better. There's also the theological component of Christian burial. That a Christian not buried on, not given the funeral rites and buried on hallowed ground is not necessarily a goner, but still
Yeah, it's not like Judaism where if you're not buried in some certain amount of time you go straight to hell or some kind of obnoxious stuff. I know for a fact that you
get sent to the back of the deli line.
You don't get your Reuben rye sandwich as fast. There were priests, obviously, of all, Catholic and Protestant, who would have been on the lines with these soldiers. That goes back to the early days of war in Europe, post-Christian Europe. There were priests there who would bless troops, hold service, so on at the churches nearby, and I'm sure that they tried to give some sort of patchwork burial rites to the men laying out in the mud in the middle of the field to ensure that they were given some dignity in death. But I think it was a lack of trust. It was a total lack of trust between two groups of people that are not very different. I mean, the French and Germans are just not very different groups of people, and the fact that they couldn't trust each other enough to arrange a body sweep says a lot. this sort of become desensitized to it. He never really comments on how disgusting it is, or if it bothers him, or if it bothers anyone. I think the men just sort of become used to marching around in mud and blood and guts daily.
Yeah.
There's also sort of I mean, I'm guessing, I know at least Titus has read Marcus Aurelius. There's a Stoic element to this chapter, where it's just sort of a Stoic retelling or Stoic chronology of this period. It's, again, like I said before, it's not dramatized. It's not blown out of proportion. It's sort of tempered.
Yeah, it reads the exact opposite. In a lot of ways, the emotionality of it is completely removed. It's very matter of fact.
This is what I was saying at the beginning of the ideal of disinterested violence.
Yes.
So the Bhagavad Gita is a much more ancient expression of this Aryan principle. But slightly later, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations would be another one. And keep in mind, he wrote those while he was on campaign. So he was slaughtering
against the Germans. No.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So he was slaughtering Germans during the day, and then goes back to his tent to compose these.
Yeah.
I mean, it shows you what kind of man he was, what kind of will he had, what kind of focus, and the ability to detach yourself from your emotions. It's not that you don't have any emotion. I'm sure Jünger, every man has emotions, but it's the ability to enter a state of detachment.
Yeah.
He's not a psychopath. He's just he had to hit some level of sternness to, I suppose, survive and thrive in a lot of ways. This is before he starts really becoming fanatical about the war and very much into fighting. It seems like this is sort of the weird intermediate period where he's sort of desensitizing himself and keeping this diary of all this death he's seeing, and probably reading back on it to remind himself that he's not special. There's nothing
by
special
the end
about him.
He's sitting like he's lying in his own blood as they're being overrun, like attempting to murmur to his comrades to make sure to fight to the death.
Yeah.
Imagine that. That was one of the most memorable scenes to me. Is just like how it all comes down and how he's trying to get out of there, and these British were gonna try and capture him. They were like blocking his path, and he just shoots him. He's like wounded, and he just pulls out his revolver and shoots him in the chest, and keeps going. Eventually, the other people have to drag him out, and then the people dragging him out start getting blown away. He's just watching everyone die.
Yeah. And that's sort of Stoic too, where he's not very emotional as that's happening towards the end. He's not screaming, and he's not like maniacally laughing either. He's just sort of trying to keep fighting. He's just trying to do his duty even to the very end.
It's the true warrior ideal.
Yeah.
Adam, you're up next.
Yeah, just listening to your guys' takes on all this, I really don't know what it's like. I mean, even after hearing all this and reading the stories, I'm very hesitant to comment on the nature of war, being that I've never been in one. So I will read this, but I will be very careful about my interpretation of it, because I think he should speak for his own experiences rather than me putting words in his mouth. So I guess this is the Battle of the Somme. And do you want me to read the whole thing, Titus, or there's a break here? What's your plan?
Go for it, my friend. Go for it.
All right. So these moments of nocturnal prowling leave an indelible impression. Eyes and ears are tense to the maximum. The rustling approach of strange feet in the tall grass, and an unutterably menacing thing. Your breath comes in shallow bursts. You have to force yourself to stifle any panting or wheezing. There is little mechanical click as the safety catch your pistol is taken off, the sound cuts straight through your nerves. Your teeth are grinding on the fuse pin of the hand grenade. The encounter will be short and murderous. You tremble with two contradictory impulses, the heightened awareness of the huntsman and the terror of the quarry. You are a world to yourself, saturated with the appalling aura of the savage landscape. Occasionally my ears were utterly deafened by a single fiendishly crashing burst of flame. Then incessant hissing gave me the sense of hundreds of pound weights rushing down at incredible speed, one after the other, where a dull shell landed with a short, heavy ground-shaking thump. Shrapnels burst by the dozens with dainty crackers, shook loose their little balls in a dense thud, and empty casings, rasps after they were gone. Every time a shell landed anywhere it does, the earth flew up and down. The metal shards drove themselves into it. It's an easier matter to describe these sounds than to endure them. But one cannot but associate every single sound of flying steel with the idea of death. And so I huddled in my hole in the ground with my hand in front of my face, imagining all the possible variants of being hit. I think I have found a comparison that captures the situation in which I and all the other soldiers who took part in this war so often found ourselves. You must imagine you are securely tied to a post, being menaced by a man swinging a heavy hammer. Now the hammer has been taken back over his head, ready to be swung. Now it's cleaving the air towards you, and the point of touching your skull, and it's struck the post. The splinters are flying. That's what it's like to experience heavy shelling in an exposed position. Luckily, I still had a bit of subliminal feeling of optimism. It'll be all right, that you feel during a game, say, and which, while it may be quite unfounded, still had a soothing effect on you. And indeed, even the shelling came to an end, and I could go on my way once more, and this time with some urgency.
So, some background, the Battle of the Somme. When you talk about World War I being the European Holocaust, the Battle of the Somme probably is the most glaring example of this. And I just want to give you some figures on this. This was the largest battle on the Western Front during World War I, and more than 3 million men were engaged in this battle, and 1 million of them were wounded or killed. So 1 out of 3.
3 million?
Yes.
Wait a minute. How long did this go on for? That's a lot.
Yeah. It took place from the 18th of November, 1916, to... Oh, no, I'm sorry. The 1st of July to the 18th of November. So...
Wow.
A decent amount of time was spent with this.
And a major killer was influenza too.
Yes. But the first day of the battle was in fact the worst day ever recorded for the British Army, and they suffered 57,470 casualties on the first day. So this is industrialized killing on a scale never before seen by man. Absolutely staggering.
Yeah, I mean it just sounds horrible.
Yeah.
So how much? How much of this was just chemical warfare too, being deployed on a massive scale? Chemical warfare didn't kill that many people, but it injured a lot, so to speak. It took a lot of guys out of the battlefield at any given time.
Yeah, and
yeah, he's describing shelling, so it's probably artillery, explosives.
Yeah, a combination of the three of you had mass charges, which ended with the 57,000. What was it? Yeah, 57,000 British dead on the first day. So you had mass charging at fortified positions. You had shelling, and you also had gas attacks, both chlorine and mustard, I believe. The chlorine, I think, being far more effective.
There's a photograph I've seen before of a man posing in front of his artillery gun, and around him he's sort of in front of a pile of empty shells of the artillery, rounds, and these things are big. I mean, they're not like, bullets from a gun. They are barrel size almost, and there is a mountain of these things, and it's just littering the entire landscape behind him. Just this is just one station, mind you, but this is just going on for years, just boom, 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 and as it were, America was actually, I think, manufacturing a lot of that stuff. So,
are you guys familiar with Wyndham Lewis's "A Battery Shelled," the painting?
No.
Let me see if I pull this up. I guess we'll put it. Well, you don't have like we do. You don't have a YouTube thing going on. You can't say.
Well,
listener.
None of these guys had ear protection either. I'm guessing, right? There was
no ear protection.
Yeah. So, like what you're describing, Adam, a lot of these guys went deaf.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure Jünger went nearly deaf.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, people who have ever been to a shooting range, you'll be caught off guard if you've never been there before, because it's like, Jesus, and so I can't even imagine what artillery is like. But you will see typically people holding their ears because it's so bad, and they definitely didn't have earplugs back then. They probably used like cotton, but it's just such a poor substitute for something we have today.
So it's also one of the first instances of tank warfare. So it was the British employing the Mark I.
Yeah, when was that? It was in the later part, but do you know what year that was? Like 16 or something?
Yeah. This was 1916. Yeah.
And they're very crude. They had very short, like a tiny cannon or on the top with like a turret that barely, I don't even know if it did 360 degrees. It did at least 180 degrees, depending on the body of the tank itself. And then it had a couple.
I remember at least maybe some of them didn't have any top turret. It was basically just side guns, and the main point was essentially to breach the trench. And oftentimes it was literally to like make a bridge, and then you would just like fall.
Yeah, those guys died.
But it was kind of like a trench buster. It wasn't exactly anti.
Yeah, you're right. It was a trench buster. Those guys would die constantly because they would try and breach a trench, and then a German soldier would just run up with a flamethrower or a grenade and just stick it in one of the holes in the side, and everyone in there died very quickly. And it was like a steel trap, because then he couldn't get out of these things very easily, because they almost like sealed themselves in. So it was the only way to kill the soldiers inside was to either blow it up or stick something in there and kill them.
Yeah, I do have to give the British credit for the kind of design. I did think it was kind of clever how they built it, because the entire tread system was all the way up to the top of the vehicle, and so it like you could literally like flip it over. It would still be able to move. Mm-hmm. But the German was basically like this kind of uncharacteristically unaesthetic, in my opinion. It was this like kind of ugly, just rectangular box, like a shoebox. That was just,
they fixed that for the next one.
Yeah. Next time around, they got better.
Yeah, Jünger actually mentions there was like rumors of this new tank that was far more maneuverable. He doesn't, I don't think, actually face one, but he does mention that it's affecting the battlefield situation, that there's the British are moving with this new tank.
You can imagine to a guy like Jünger, who went into this with high-minded ambitions, probably thinking of the Franco-Prussian War and that style of warfare. And this is what you get. You get these giant, I'm trying to think of how he would phrase it, a giant moving rectangle, just a giant black rectangle shooting out of all sides, up and down the battlefield, occasionally blowing up, or someone ripping the doors off and shooting inside of it. Like this is just like totally bizarre. Coming up to that point, the context of human warfare, totally bizarre sight to see. The closest thing to it would be, I guess, huge packs of horseback archers or chariots in human history. But even then, nothing comes close to the absurdness of it.
It has to be as staggering to the eye as the Aztecs witnessing mounted Spaniards, right?
Right.
In armor. It has to
Well,
be as insane an image.
right.
Yeah.
Well, here's
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
well, I was gonna here's him describing some bit of artillery stuff. So, in the platoon to the left of us, Sergeant Hawk, the unfortunate rat catcher of Monchi, which from an earlier part, this guy was he was catching rats when they're before things started getting very hairy in their leisure time beforehand. That was how we were introduced to the guy. But so Hawk, the rat catcher, aimed to discharge a white flare, picked up the wrong flare, and instead sent up a red barrage light, which was taken up in all quarters. Straight away our own artillery opened up, and it was a joy to behold. One shell after another came yowling down out of the sky and showered the field ahead of us in a fountain of shards and sparks upon impact, a mixture of dust, stale gases, and the reek of flung carcasses brewed up from the craters. After this orgy of destruction, the shelling quickly flooded back to its previous levels. One man's slip of the hand got the whole titanic machinery of war rolling. Nice little vignette.
Yeah, that's a beautiful little passage.
Again, the sentimentalism is lacking,
Mm-hmm.
which is good.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And you do have that in that passage. You certainly do note not Junger's love of mechanized warfare, but his love of like mobilization, which is a huge facet for him. And listeners would regard our previous episode on Junger on pain, which is one of his chief points of that essay, is the necessity of total mobilization, and you see that as his description of the choir of artillery going off at once. Beautiful and terrifying. But just with regards to the Battle of the Somme, I don't pro Anglo post an awful lot on this podcast, as listeners and friends can tell. I have my loyalties lie elsewhere, but I do want to bring light on one of my favorite poets, actually. The gentleman was named William Noel Hodgson. He's an English poet from the First World War, and I just wanted to read you all a poem of his last poem, in fact, as Mr. Hodgson was actually killed on the first day of the Somme. So I just wanted to read this out to you, gentlemen, and see what you think. The poem is called Before Action. By all the glories of the day and the cool evening's benison, by the last sunset touch that lay upon the hills when day was done, by beauty lavishly outpoured and blessings carelessly received, by all the days that I have lived, make me a soldier, Lord. By all of all man's hopes and fears, and all the wonders poets sing, the laughter of unclouded years, and every sad and loving thing, by the romantic ages stored with high endeavor that was his, by all his mad catastrophes, make me a man, O Lord. I, that on my familiar hill saw with uncomprehending eyes 100 of thy sunsets spill their fresh and sanguine sacrifice. Ere the sun swings his noonday sword, must say good-bye to all of this. By all delights that I shall miss, help me die, O Lord. This was written in 2006. This was written in 1916, 2 days before his death, the first day of the Somme. So,
kind of sad.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Stands in stark difference to Junger's memoirs, where you have that, a stark level of detachment. With Hodgson, the final lines of the poem says it all. He's expecting death.
Well, there's also the famous Flanders Field, which is again, you got that same sentimentalism and the tragedy.
Yeah.
But again, from our perspective here, I mean, it was a tragedy.
Yeah.
There's no question about this.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the one with the scene where he finds the English dugout, the English trench, and he describes it's like these armchairs all neatly around a fire, and he's described it as a taste of merry old England.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's an element to the way Younger kind of pitches the English. It's just sort of they're very much like the Germans to him, obviously, in their fighting prowess, but that they're very merry, and they're very sort of erratic, and they're always lively. All of his descriptions of them, and a lot of the ways Germans have described the English, throughout the centuries, have always been lively and merry, despite all of the gloom we always associate with English humor. I think at their core, the English are very, very, very cheerful group of people who always seem to find humor in even in bad situations, which is where that sort of Cockney attitude comes from.
And something also, just Nick, in your referencing of the little bit of home among the trenches. I mean, that's something that the English historically are known for in wars, is trying to not normalize their conditions, but saturate it with enough of the familiar in which they're able to be comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, for all the people I know bash the English, but as Jünger described, I mean, and we have every reason to bash the English political system.
Yeah, not the soldierly. That's yeah.
Or just the culture and the while they have certainly a different character than the German. They at the end of the day they fought. They fought, as Jünger pointed out, they fought as well as he could have, as well as he could have wanted from an enemy, from an opponent. They fought honorably, and they fought to the death.
Yeah.
But a moment ago, what caught me up is I was mixing up the Flanders Fields with the Wilfred Owen poem. That's what was tripping me up. The one that ends with the old lie. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, which is it's beautiful to die for one's country. Describes that as the lie, the old lie. Mm-hmm. But is it a lie? I don't know. You decide.
Depends on your country, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And we can kind of, in closing, maybe get into applying sort of Jünger's ethos to the current year and what that really means. Mm-hmm. But did we want to read some more portions out of it?
Sure, yeah. Let's see here. Who's next up?
Maybe Hanzo.
I think I am.
Hans, you got yourself a large section here, my friend. But go.
Thank you.
You can break it up if you want. Someone.
No, I'll tackle it. I'll go for it here. No sooner had we got hack from this interruption to our lunch, there was more pandemonium. It was one of those curious incidents that can suddenly and unpredictably transform an entire situation. The noise was coming from a subaltern in the regiment on our left, who wanted to line up with us and seemed inflamed by his berserk fury. Drink seemed to have tipped his innate bravery into a towering rage. Where are the Tommies? Let me at 'em. Come on, boys, who's coming with me? In his insensate fury, he knocked over our fine barricade and plunged forward, clearing a path for himself with hand grenades. His orderly slipped ahead of him along the trench, shooting down anyone who survived the explosions. So this is, I want to comment, this is probably one of the most vivid descriptions of combat I've ever heard. So this guy is apparently just running around throwing hand grenades at the English front line, and then anyone who doesn't die gets just executed in the crater.
Yeah. There's I don't know. I this section spoke to me of the berserkers of the Vikings, just sort of getting drunk and just throwing caution in the wind, and instead of axes, you're throwing potato mashers.
Yeah, this sounds. I mean, I believe it. I believe that he's telling the truth. But it sounds almost too violent to believe. It seems just totally beyond the pale. Mm-hmm. Bravery, fearless risking of one's own life is always inspiring. We too found ourselves picked up by his wild fury, and scrabbling along to grab a few hand grenades, rushed to form part of this berserker's progress. Soon I was up alongside him, tearing along the line, and the other officers too, followed by riflemen from my company, weren't slow in coming. Even Captain von Brixen, the battalion commander, was up there in the van, rifle in hand, bringing down enemy grenade throwers over our heads. The British resisted manfully. Every traverse had to be fought for. The black balls of Mills bombs crossed in the air with our own long-handed grenades. Behind every traverse we captured, we found corpses or bodies still twitching. We killed each other, sight unseen. We too suffered losses. A piece of iron crashed to the ground next to the orderly, which the fellow was unable to avoid, and he collapsed to the ground while his blood issued onto the clay from many wounds. We hurtled over his body and charged forward. Thunderous crashes painted us the way. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were lying in wait behind rifles and machine guns in the dead land. We were already a long way in front of our own lines. From all sides, bullets whistled round our steel helmets or struck up the trench parapet with a hard crack. Each time a black iron oval broke the horizon, one's eyes sized it up with that instantaneous clarity of which a man is only capable in moments of life and death. So he's essentially talking about like the huge adrenaline rush you get when your reflexes need to kick in, and you sort of, I'm sure all guys have had this happen at one point in their lives. Like you just sort of become a robot. You're not even really there. Your adrenaline and your instincts function for you. So you'll pull off something you didn't think you could pull off. Maybe you're falling in a tree and you manage to grab a branch with one hand and swing yourself out of like breaking your neck. And you don't even realize what you've done until you're on the ground safe and your heart's pumping. And it's sort of it's a pretty amazing feeling, especially the come down from that. Mm. If if you survive, especially like unharmed, and you have all the adrenaline pumping through your veins, it's pretty incredible. I've had that happen a few times on bad hikes where I've almost gone off the side and grabbed at something fast enough to not.
That's where adrenaline junkies come from.
Yeah, to not perish. Yeah, what's that movie? The Hurt Locker. It's probably the best example of this in the modern era.
In combat, then there's people who just feel compelled to jump off of higher and higher objects.
Yeah,
it's like with the wingsuits and
yeah.
Well, there's that earlier passage in Storm of Steel where Jünger sort of pauses and says that there's a duality of emotion that like a soldier has. You are at the same moment you are a hunter and also the prey, and
right.
That's a really good metaphor for this feeling, I think.
During those instants of waiting, you had to try to get to a place where you could see as much of the sky as possible, because it was only against its pale backdrop that it was possible to see the black, jagged iron of those deadly balls with sufficient clarity. Then you hurled your own bomb and leaped forward. One barely glanced at the crumpled body of one's opponent. He was finished, and a new duel was commencing. The exchange of hand grenades reminded me of fencing with foils. You needed to jump and stretch, almost as in a ballet. It's the deadliest of duels, and it invariably ends with one or the other of the participants being blown to smithereens, or both. In those moments, I was capable of seeing the dead. I jumped over them with every stride without horror, then lay there in the relaxed and softly spilled attitude that characterizes those moments in which life takes its leave. During my leaping progress, I had a difference of opinion with the subaltern, who was really quite a card. He wanted to be first and insisted that I supply him with bombs rather than throw them myself. And amongst the short, terrible shouts that accompany the work, and by which you alert the other to the presence of the enemy, I would sometimes hear him, "One man to throw," and after all, I was the instructor at the Stormtrooper training. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
Well, how he encapsulates throwing grenades at each other is just like a good old fashioned fencing duel with friends in the backyard or something like that. I mean, at this point, he's far gone. He's any sort of boyish adventurism is out the window.
Yeah.
It's now just. I mean, I guess he's become a man officially.
Mm-hmm.
He became a man at 19 or 20 when he's throwing grenades as hard as he can, as fast as he can at English soldiers while running around right in front of their front lines.
Well, when they start executing prisoners too, that's kind of a big moment of like, well, I didn't really think I'd be doing this.
Yeah, I mean, most people, the biggest complaint about going to war now is you just do all the paperwork. Like, you're mad. You didn't think you'd be sitting doing paperwork for 3 weeks at a time or hanging out fixing cars. Like, you figured, you're going to be running and gunning for days on end in the streets of Baghdad.
Yeah, well, that's the American experience because we have the world's largest history military ever. So it's basically, they call it the tooth to tail ratio. It's like 1 to 10 or something. I mean, most people just work in the back office in the military.
Well, like the guy who allegedly shot up that church the other day.
Yeah. Yeah, he was apparently just a logistics guy. Never did anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's what is it, Black Hawk Down, where the Ewan McGregor plays the desk jockey.
Yeah.
The data entry clerk.
Yeah, I actually just rewatched that.
Yeah. Who gets on his first combat assignment, and it's in the streets of Mogadishu.
Mogadishu, yeah.
It's also Tom Hardy's first film.
Yeah. And there's at one point where he, I don't know, I can't remember what happens. Oh, he slips and falls, and some Somalian shoots an RPG right at him, and it explodes right next to him.
Yeah, they have to dig him out.
No, he's fine. And then he's sitting there, and then another one hits, and there's just bullets coming all around, and he just starts running back, screaming like "fuck this!" Immediately realizing that trying to play the hero, almost got rewarded him with 2 RPGs and
well, actually in that scene, just because I just thought he does. Now I remember what you were saying. He does go run out into the firing line and shoot a grenade at the at the technical.
Yeah. So I've never heard of dueling grenade matches, but this is I guess the brilliance of Jünger is you get to experience World War One through a perspective you'd never thought you would ever see. That's pretty amazing. You always think of World War One as just the occasional giant wave of men, as Adam was describing, and then just a lot of boring pot shots from the trench for years on end.
Well, it's a perfect passage, just retelling what the Stormtroopers were all about, right? This was the assault division, These were the assault divisions. They were the ones who, not going in mass waves, but going in squads and trying to cause as much havoc and mayhem as they could possibly do to the Brits.
Certainly, and keep in mind though, as an author, you're going to highlight the highlights. You're not going to mention, I sat in my cot again. I did that thing today. They're going to describe the action.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he does go into the monotony.
Yeah, and that's probably the
card
worst.
Playing and the drinking and
the monotony and
drinking.
daily life is like the worst thing for him. Blowing up people.
Well, it is interesting as a contrast, and it's how many people actually know what that's like. So I find it interesting to a degree, but I do think he's going to weight the action more than the rest of it, even though in terms of the time spent, it probably is less.
Yeah,
it's by no means. I mean, considering like he could have probably written a 700,000-page book on his experiences, with it include more reflection and maybe more. That was where he probably.
I suppose a diary would be just a literal like chronology of what the whole war was about, but would be incredibly long.
Yeah, I mean,
probably wouldn't.
He could go into
take the time to put all the
politics or what have you. It is definitely a shrunk down version of his. It's not a long book.
Yeah, it's not.
In terms of it's an interesting point to make though. In terms of sort of like highlighting the mundaneness of war. Have any of you gentlemen seen the movie Jarhead or read the book?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That's an excellent example of a soldier in a war that doesn't fight.
Well, and he gets one opportunity to actually shoot someone, and then like they blow up.
Yeah.
The target instead, or with an airstrike, and that's when he just snaps.
Yeah.
So, do you want to read you have a final part here, Titus?
Oh yeah. Well, do you want to get into to what you wanted to talk about, Nick, or do you want to me to wrap up?
Well, that's what I was.
Yeah, we can do this.
Well, I wanted to do I had two final things. I wanted to talk a little bit about how we would apply his ethos today and what it really means. Because no one, I mean, as I said earlier, the current year does not produce Ernst Jungers.
Yeah.
So I suppose if we could make ourselves at least a quarter of the man that he was, I think it would do a lot for us and for our struggle. But take modern America, the modern Zog military. Do you guys believe that you can apply this kind of metaphysics to it, that you can participate in that? And I'm not, I understand there's going to be veterans who may be listening to this. So I'm not, it's not a personal attack on anyone, but do you, for, some men are just, they feel very compelled to do this. I mean, I'm not a veteran myself, and I have definitely at points considered it, but have long since ruled it out completely. And I also caution anyone who's considering joining the military to not join the military. Or if you must, join the military in some capacity where you take more from Uncle Sam than you have to give.
Right.
That is, you get maybe some training or something that you want, but don't give them your blood and don't give them your soul.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you can imply like.
Isn't that what most people are there for these days, though?
Yeah,
you ask the question to Ernst Junger.
Yes, of course.
I think, but a lot of these guys are there just to get a paycheck.
Yeah, I would strongly advise people not to do that, but I've heard people, there's people who want this training they want to get or something.
I mean, I've always said if the goddamn U.S. military would actually defend the U.S. borders, Mexico, for example, I would be willing to fight. But I'm not going to fight a war for Israel. This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well, they won't even. It's not even like simple. the Roman Empire. It's just as cynical. But you don't even get the glory of Rome. And you don't even get to indulge in plundering these places. Like, I remember reading that the majority of the post-Iraq War oil contracts have gone to the Chinese.
Yeah. So
we didn't even. I mean, the Democrats are still screaming that Bush went there for oil. We didn't get any of it. I mean, if we did go there for that, and we didn't succeed in that, I mean that was
the standard college liberal. Oh, we're just going there for oil. And I'm like, dude, did we get anything out of this? It was the military contractors and Halliburton got some money, but the United States lost big.
It was
actually, and the politicians sacrificed the country for their own gain.
Yeah, that was actually the blood for no blood for oil was actually one of my first sojourns onto the Jewish question, actually, because I started noticing that a lot of Jews were promulgating
like blood for no oil.
Yeah. Well, but a lot of leftist Jews took up that slogan and that line of argumentation to sort of obfuscate,
exactly
the role of Zionism.
It's because you asked what's the value of that propaganda? Well, that propaganda is to misattribute the causes of the war,
exactly,
so that the dialectic of the people for it or against it are arguing about this. It's for revenge for 9/11. We got to go invade Iraq in order to get revenge against the 19 Saudi hijackers.
Yeah.
It's
right. Well, what you were saying,
whatever you do, don't look into the Yanon plan.
Yeah, what you were saying about the metaphysics, I think that they try and ascribe that to Mattis, Sec Def Mattis, but but him, I think it's just sort of a personality cult.
Yeah,
he seems like a poor man's Patton. That's what he sort of.
He just comes off as a psychopath because of it.
Yeah.
He's just talking about. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, he's a Kaganite.
Yes, he is.
Yeah. And
no, that's McMaster.
And
Sorry.
A possible homosexual too.
McMaster is the Kaganite.
No. Mattis is also a Kagan guy. He has soldiers read Kagan history stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There you go. To the point that we talk about the metaphysics, let me read. Here's just this bit from Julius Evola. When I say apply this ethos to the modern day, this is what I'm referring to. So, the fundamental principle underlying all justifications of war from the point of view of human personality is heroism. War, it is said, offers man the opportunity to awaken the hero who sleeps within him. War breaks the routine of comfortable life by means of its severe ordeals. It offers a transfiguring knowledge of life according to death. The moment the individual succeeds in living as a hero, even if it's the final moments of his earthly life, weigh infinitely more on the scale of values than a protracted existence spent consuming monotonously among the trivialities of cities. From a spiritual point of view, these possibilities make up for the negative and destructive tendencies of war, which are one-sidedly and tendenciously highlighted by pacifist materialism. War makes one realize the relativity of human life, and therefore also the law of more than life. And thus war has always an anti-materialist value, a spiritual value. And of course, such considerations have indisputable merit and cut off the chattering of humanitarianism, sentimental grizzling, and the protests of the champions of the immortal principles and of the international, of the heroes of the pen. Nevertheless, it must be acknowledged that in order to define, and it goes on to outline for the chapter, but that you get the idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
War as fundamental. If you find value in war, a war for its sake, or the warrior life. It is fundamentally an anti-materialist value. But in the case, like, this isn't something that can apply. You got to be careful when you think about it as war as something that only political bodies can conduct.
Right.
Because this is certainly, from a spiritual point of view, it certainly does not outweigh. It doesn't make up for the loss of serving something that is fundamentally evil or fundamentally diseased, fundamentally against life, which would of course be the American empire.
Well, and in that, Nick, like, the system of the American Armed Forces will never take up that mantle of the metaphysics of combat. We can
because it's a police organization, right?
Yes.
That's the justification, is that
it's also anti-heroic, right? Like, the United States Armed Forces, and this isn't to say anything against the gentlemen who served or who are still serving in the armed forces, but as an organization, it is anti-heroic. It is more of a bureaucracy than anything else, and
it's anti-white.
And it is anti-white. So, yeah. Yeah, I think in terms of, your sort of your first question is what can we, the United States Armed Forces is not going to be imbued with any of these philosophies, with this philosophy, for as long as Zog remains. But I think just on a personal level, as you said there, as what Evelyn said there, is that it is, the heroic can be in a group, it could be in a country, but it's focused on the individual first and foremost. And I think implementing, and this is a meme of mine that I'm going to be promulgating more and more as sort of bickering and infighting just sort of continues on the dissident right. We need to take a serious look at stoicism as a group ideology and as a group philosophy, because I think there's a lot of really potent and important things that we can use from that worldview.
Well, and that worldview is it is a perennial worldview, and it's in all forms. The ones that I have mentioned before. Go read the Bhagavad Gita, read Aurelius' Meditations, and read Ernst Junger.
Yeah.
And you'll see that they are all cut from the same exact cloth.
Yeah, it's a philosophy Catholics, Protestants, pagans, atheists, and esoteric Hitlerists can all get behind. It's literally a philosophy for everyone in our circles. So,
because if you're going to live, if you want to live for struggle, make sure that what you do isn't against your people, isn't against your interests either. I mean, I'm not talking about material interests per se. I'm talking, if you want to live for sacrifice and struggle, do it for the right reasons. And do it. You put your energies in a direction that is for us.
Yeah.
Well, I when I was having a difficult time in a particular assignment or something in college, I would often ask myself, is it really worth what I'm doing at this moment? I mean, is this class going to actually help me in my life? And if the answer was no, I would sort of compare it to this. Struggle without reward is sort of analogous to taking a sledgehammer, going to Mount Everest, and doing your damnedest to knock it over. It's pointless. And so just make sure your effort gets you somewhere.
And the effort that eventually was rewarded for Younger, I mean, the reward was eternal glory. Like it went down as one of the greatest war heroes in German history to this day.
I'm gonna have to counter a little bit of that, because that does go contrary to the spiritual, the metaphysics of war as outlined by these traditions I'm talking about. Well, you gotta be careful about with reward. The problem is we live in a sick time. in a sick order. So there's no the natural functions of a society where these energies are normally, because I guarantee you there are, whether they share our worldviews or not, there are plenty of probably very solid material that are being used by our enemies. You know, these because they go through the natural process. They go where, I mean, like Jünger, a young man wants to go fight. He wants adventure. These are natural inclinations. I mean, but in a proper, like if in a healthy order, the quality you would want is exactly that. The opposite of that is to act without any interest for reward.
Or rather, the interest of reward is in the in Heidegger's sense a good end, right? You know, we're all, you know, having the understanding
It's a
that
non-personal end.
exactly, yeah, having the understanding that, look, you know, we are all subject to, you know, to our own mortality, that we are all going to die. The best outcome, the best possible outcome, isn't, you know, awards or adulation. It's doing your duty and meeting your possible end, wherever that may come, with, you know, with stride, with a sense of nobility to it.
But I mean, yes, and that's my criticism. But I would also agree with Adam in a major way in that because this world is sick, you got to have some critical thinking.
Yeah.
Like you can't. The spirit's not good enough. It's not. It's honor. Like honor matters. Honor is important, but it's in a world. Honor is worth nothing to the people who have power.
Right.
It's only money.
Yeah, you gotta. I mean, you know, the South, and just to clarify, I don't just mean everybody themselves has to benefit. I apply this to a group mainly, you know, in general. But you know, I think the individual should also ask himself that question within reason. But I was just going to say, you know, the South, because they lost the Civil War in the United States, often compares themselves to the Northerners as having more honor. And that's really all they have, is because they lost. And I wouldn't even disagree that, you know, their sort of culture and conduct, even in the war itself, but also just in general, even today, has a very high value placed on honor. But unfortunately, they're still losing. If you look at the statue removals and just the culture domination of, you know, the West Coast and the Northeast, pushed into their part of the country, they're losing. And so it's not sufficient. You know, honor is great, and it's wonderful if your society has that value. But just like in game theory, you know, the prisoner's dilemma, if your cohort in crime, partner in crime, is not honorable and you're going to get the worst of it.
Exactly.
So you have to make sure that the game is fair.
Yeah.
Show honor to your people, because if it's not going to be reciprocated to your enemy, your enemy will show you none. They will show you no honesty, they will show you no honor, and they will show you no mercy, and you should show them none.
Yeah. Well, the paradigm of liberal warfare began in World War I, continues to this day, and we are, whether or not you are of German ethnic extraction, we are all the Huns together. So, you know, be prepared to be seen on posters skewering babies. You know.
Right. Exactly. And to answer my own question, I think we can apply Jünger. We can, and as you were saying, Ty, study Aurelius, study Stoicism, study the Bhagavad Gita, but do not get tricked into supporting one of the system. Don't apply this energy to. Don't give the state your blood and soul.
Yeah, I think that's well put. Well put. Well, let me read out the final passage of this memoir, and we'll get closing thoughts, gentlemen. This is the final passages of Storm of Steel. During the endless hours flat on your back, you try to distract yourself to pass the time. Once, I reckoned up my wounds. leaving out trifles such as ricochets and grazes. I was hit at least 14 times, these being 5 bullets, 2 shrapnel splinters, 1 shrapnel ball, 4 hand grenade splinters, and 2 bullet splinters, which, with entry and exit wounds, left me an even 20 scars. In the course of this war, where so much of the firing was done blindly into empty space, I still managed to get myself targeted no fewer than 11 times. I felt every justification, therefore, in donning the gold wound stripes, which arrived for me one day. A fortnight later, I was lying in a rumbled bed of a hospital train. The German landscape was already bathed in the luster of early autumn. I was fortunate enough to be taken off the train at Hanover, and was put in the Clementine Infirmary. Among the visitors who soon arrived, I was particularly glad to see my brother. He continued to grow since his wounding, although his right side, which was where he was hurt, hadn't. I shared my room with a young fighter pilot from Richthofen's squadron, a man named Wenzel, who was one of the tall and fearless types our nation still produces. He lived up to the motto of his squadron, quote, "hard and crazy with it," and had already brought down a dozen opponents in single combat, although the last had splintered his upper arm with a bullet first. The first time I went out, I went with him, my brother, and a few comrades, who were awaiting their transport, to the rooms of the old Hanoverian Gibraltar Regiment. Since our war-worthiness was being put into question, we felt the urgent need to prove ourselves by vaulting an enormous armchair. We didn't do too well. Wenzel broke his arm all over again, and the following day I was back in bed with a temperature of 40. Yes, my chart even threatened the red line beyond which the doctors are powerless to help. At such high temperatures you lose your sense of time. While the sisters were fighting for my life, I was in those fever dreams that are so often very amusing. On one of those days, it was the 22nd of September, 1918, I received the following telegram from General von Busse. Quote, "His Majesty the Kaiser has bestowed upon you the Order pour le Mérite. In the name of the whole division, I congratulate you." And thus ends Storm of Steel. And just for clarification, Richthofen's squadron, of course, the famed Red Baron of Germany.
He's one hell of a man.
Yeah.
I wanted to note throughout the whole book, it's not expressly political. So if you're coming to Storm of Steel hoping for politics, or an insight into Junger's politics, or for this early 20th century German reactionary political philosophy we mentioned, you won't really find it here. You mostly find his politics in his fiction, I would say, and in things like On Pain.
Well, if you want his politics, the fiction you're going to be disappointed in On the Marble Cliffs. I have not read it. I was talking to Tyus before the show, but
Ernst Junger is more of the politics,
right?
Like the national anarchism kind of stuff.
Yeah, the anarch. Yes, that's true. But also read his essays from the 1920s, from the German conservative revolutionary movement. I'll try to find. I'll find some and I'll link. You have show notes, right, Titus?
Yep.
I'll put some in the show notes.
Excellent. Well, closing thoughts, gentlemen, on Junger the Man and Storm of Steel, his memoirs.
You guys go first.
I'll just be short. I admire the man's dedication to what he believes in. I wish I had something similar in my life that allowed me to commit myself to the degree that he committed himself. But it just hasn't happened in America. There's no worthy cause that I've seen in a long time. It's we'll see. But it's I think that's what people recognize in him. You know, they admire his dedication and his sincerity. I don't know if he glorifies the whole enterprise of war in retrospect, but he's certainly a excellent chronicler of it. He's a very good writer, and I appreciate his lack of
This
lack of nuance. I mean, it's basically just these are the sort of hard experiences, and there's not a whole lot of commentary, it seems. So I like the primary rawness of it all.
This book was the original white jihad, and I mean that in a very specific sense.
It's Prussian jihad.
No, I mean it's spirit. It's a holy war.
Yeah.
Spiritual struggle, and it don't fight for Zog.
Yeah. You know, I would say that a great companion to this would be to read History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. It's one of my favorite books because it's sort of like the military republic red pill on Sparta, and which was actually sort of the inspiration for Prussia, which then built the Second Kaiserreich that Jünger fought under. But it has that that grand sweep to the war, and it doesn't get as much into the minutia of the battles, some of them, but it's more about these heroic figures. But if you want a modern companion to it that is brutal, and it has very dynamic language, and it has much more gristle. It's not for the faint of heart, and we didn't even get into some of the more gruesome descriptions he gets into, and it's certainly not for someone looking for a nice little history of World War I from German perspective. It's probably the best way to offset any boring or just massively overscaled history book, is to take a look at the war memoirs of someone who actually lived and carved his way through history.
Yeah, I'd want to mirror Hans's remarks as far as a historical document, and it's a shame. Take it for granted, though, judging by the fascination that we all have with World War II and the paramount significance of it. World War I is we wouldn't have fascism and we wouldn't have National Socialism without World War I. These are ideologies that were birthed in the trenches and in the battle zones of the First World War. And I think to have a very clear understanding of conservative revolutionary and National Socialist and fascist ideology, one has to study World War I and the significance and the import that it had for the whole of our people. This was a European Holocaust, and the tragedy of it should be dissected and mourned over. But despite this being an excellent historical document, there is a burgeoning sense of Junger's philosophy, and we've touched upon it in this episode. The philosophy of strategic detachment, philosophy of stoicism, and these are valid philosophies, and philosophies that we should take a very, very hard look at and consider adopting for our future, for our movement, whatever it will end up being in the end. But Stoicism, we're going to be the last progenitors of Stoicism, whether we win or lose. So why don't we adopt it and see how it goes? So with that, I want to thank my friends from Myth of the 20th Century. Hans, Nick, Adam, and thank you very much for joining us. It was absolute pleasure, gentlemen, having you on.
Thanks, Titus. I had fun.
Thanks for having us on.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, until next time, dear friends, this has been Kulturkampf, episode 55.